Today we gather to celebrate the Feast of the Incarnation. And you're thinking, oh boy, he's lost it in the summer heat, huh? It isn't Christmas. But in fact, this is the day we celebrate the meaning of the Feast of the Incarnation, Corpus Christi, the body of Christ. I think the easiest way to remember the meaning of this feast is by the furniture that's used, tables and chairs. One needs the other to make sense, and you can't use one without the other. Now, to be honest, at the table of the Last Supper, they would have reclined, not using chairs, but Jesus makes it clear in his action in John's Gospel that the Eucharist does not end at the table, but proceeds to the chairs where his disciples will have their feet washed. Perhaps John realized that after decades that the other Gospels had been read, he needed to explain the real meaning behind the breaking of the bread and the sharing of the cup. He makes it into an active ritual of servanthood and solidarity with the world. In other words, Jesus does not just give them and us something to think about, but also something to do. When he said, "Do this in memory of me," he was not just referring to the breaking of the bread, but to his example of radical hospitality, calling his body, the church, to be the servant of the world. The gospel we heard just now of the feeding of the multitude was from St. Luke, but St. John, while telling the same story, puts even more emphasis upon its meaning in terms of discipleship. Our actions at the altar must translate into the actions of our lives. St. Augustine said it so powerfully, "Behold who you are, become what you receive." The other reading that helps us understand the fact that we are celebrating the meaning of the Feast of the Incarnation is the second reading we heard today from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Now, it's important to see where Paul places his account of the Last Supper. It's not in chronological order or setting among the various incidents of Jesus' arrest, trial, imprisonment, way of the cross, and crucifixion. Rather, Paul situates the Last Supper story in the setting of a very serious problem within the Corinthian Christian community itself. Now, it helps to understand that the Corinthian Christian community was not a particularly pleasant group of people. We know this from the 13th chapter of this same letter that is often read at weddings. You know, love is patient, love is kind, etc. It can mislead us down a romantic and emotional path toward warm, fuzzy love. No. The Corinthians were a miserable lot, and they were constantly quarreling and bickering. And Paul writes this section of his first letter to tell them that love, in fact, is hard work. It requires patience and understanding, and it entails forgiveness and sacrifice. And then Paul's story of the Last Supper that we've just heard has a similar purpose in this letter. You see, when the Corinthians came together to celebrate the Eucharist, there were serious divisions in the community. Paul describes the situation in this way, quote, "When you meet in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in eating, each one of you goes ahead with his own supper, and one goes hungry while another gets drunk." The better off Corinthians were bringing abundant food and drink, whereas the poor brought little or nothing. Paul gives his readers and us a powerful reminder that the Eucharist is meant to create and promote unity in the community between the wealthy and the poor, the well-fed and the hungry, the haves and the have-nots. And we might add in our own day, unity between the church and the world. Paul is pointing out that the body of Christ is to be found not just on the table, but around the table in the chairs. He warns, "Whoever eats and drinks without recognizing the body of Christ eats and drinks a judgment on himself." Now, Paul's not talking about denying the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. What he is saying is you aren't recognizing the body of Christ among you, around you, as you. And what about us? Around 40 years ago, the American bishops echoed in some ways the warning of St. Paul to the Corinthians. They wrote that the health of an economy is not to be measured by the portfolios of the rich and powerful. The health of the economy is to be measured, rather, by the way in which the poor and the weak are cared for. And Pope Francis would add, not just poor persons, but our increasingly impoverished planet. These actions of breaking bread and caring for the other call us to recognize the world around us, a world burdened by so much suffering and pain, a world that so desperately needs to be reborn to true life, a world that so desperately needs to be fed, a world where mothers put their children to bed early because they have no food to give them for supper, must be changed so that all have adequate food. A world where people eat alone and forgotten and unloved must be changed so that all have adequate dignity and care. A world where food is eaten in places torn apart by war and violence and death must be changed so that all can eat the bread of freedom and peace. When we eat here and how we eat here must change us today and every time we come to gather around this, the Lord's table. We must move from this table to serving all those who sit in the chairs that surround us, whose grimy feet need to be washed, whose hungry lives need to be fed, whose broken hearts need to be mended. This is what we are called to celebrate on this feast of Corpus Christi, this feast of the meaning of the Incarnation, this feast of the body of Christ. Jesus among us, Jesus within us, and Jesus in the world through us.